Hi everyone, it's Dexter from A2K, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Standardizing Your Revit Content Creation. Content Application Specialist Dan Hines will be presenting for us today. So before we start, we'll just go through about A2K. We're all about fostering innovation through consulting and training. A2K Technologies plays a vital role in helping infrastructure, building, mining, construction, architecture, and manufacturing industries reach full potential by delivering complete technology solutions and support services such as education and consulting. We work with visionaries to shape the future of design and in turn enable them through innovation to minimize risks, improve productivities and achieve excellence. A2K Technologies is considered the business partner of choice and trusted advisor by vendors and clients. We partner with major software and hardware vendors to meet our clients' technology needs. We strive to exceed client expectations by understanding their challenges and delivering solutions through experience and innovation. We work with clients and companies of any size nationally and abroad. Over to you, Dan.
So yeah, just a bit of background about myself, I suppose. So as Dexter mentioned, my role is the content application specialist here at A2K. So for the past 5 years, my role has been focused on creating the Revit components that would essentially populate your projects. You download them, load them into your projects, and these may be generic sort of bespoke content that we build for specific companies that have, requirements that are, I guess, specific to them. It could also be manufacturer content, and I'll go into that in a little second, but that would be typically when a manufacturer of a product would engage with us, knowing that the value of having their objects as a Revit component and getting that into the projects at an earlier stage ultimately sort of translates to essentially greater chance of being scheduled come procurement at the end of the design phase, because by that stage essentially allowances have been made for what that thing looks like and how much room it takes up, etc. So I'm coming from this, I suppose, more in a sense of creating the content in a consistent way to essentially reduce the negative impacts that may occur on the project. And I'm sure you're all sort of familiar with what they may be, but I'll touch on those and I guess some useful approaches to tackling those. So that's just a bit, I guess, a bit of a background on my role here. And I'll just give an overview. I don't want to assume that everyone sort of knows what Revit families are or content, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I just want to sort of make sure that we've all sort of got a base level of knowledge on Revit content. So essentially all of the elements that you bring into your project, so whether that be 2D callouts or tags or detail components or 3D objects like your doors and windows, these are all referred to as families. So it could be 3D, it could be 2D. Obviously, having the ability to load in these sort of pre-built families of either real-world products or generic items is a great tool that BIM provides us. So, that's one of the many advantages of a program like Revit, where we're no longer sort of constrained by drawing lines and having to manipulate those. We're able to place a 3D element, assign parameters to that element to get it to, grow in shape, change in material, change its position and sizing and that sort of thing, all dynamically within the project, as well as having that object automatically update across all views that you would be seeing that object in. So as I mentioned, I'm sure a lot of you are sort of across that already, but just wanting to sort of make it clear that when I'm talking about families, and I'll show you a bit of a workflow at the end as well. I mean, largely this will be looking at loadable components, because these are the components that would live externally out of a project file. So an RFA file, which is what we call a loadable component. And that's what I'll be focusing on, but I'll also look at some system families like walls and roofs, and some tools that we might be able to use to achieve consistency there. So Yeah, I think just to break that down a bit further in terms of, I guess, what a Revit family is. So basically anything that we would load into our projects, be it 3D or 2D, would ultimately, in some way, shape, or form, be referred to as a Revit family. So under your 3D sort of components, we've got the system families, which is what I just touched on then, being walls, floors, roofs, ceilings, etc. The component families, which is what I would say most of my time is spent creating. So these are your .rfa files that can be downloaded and plonked into your project. Detail component families and annotation families like tags and symbols, etc. And then I suppose bridging that gap between 3D and 2D, we also have the in-place families, which is kind of a standalone modeling space that you would use for specific project items. I wouldn't say I spend too much time in the in-place families creation zone, but I suppose the fundamental the core sort of concepts of this consistent approach to content could very easily apply to all of this stuff. And ultimately, everything that we create and put into our project brings in with it all of the data, all of the materials, all of the subcategories, if there are any, into this project. And that's important because Revit is essentially a visual database. So as with any database, if we put garbage in, we're going to get garbage out. So that's something to consider, because I think a lot of different places that you'll go to for Revit content, they're created by a range of different people, or with their own sort of ideas of how to best do it. Some don't really care, and that gets dangerous because all of the back end stuff that lives in those in the content that you put in your project will ultimately come in and occupy space and memory in that project. So when I'm talking about creation standards, there are sort of, I guess, a few real world applications or examples, I should say. And this is, I guess, this note here is just sort of what I was touching on there, as in any of the materials and the geometry, etc., that we have in the files that we are putting in our projects, they ultimately end up in those projects. So for that reason, it is important that we adopt and sort of maintain a level of consistency when it comes to building these Revit components. And I guess I've just sort of mentioned here, that might be region specific, it could be industry specific, or it could be specific to your design firm. It could be all three, it could be a combination. So it doesn't have to be an existing I guess standard that's out there and available. It could be one that you would create from scratch. It's just important that it is applied and adopted across the entire company. And essentially, this is going to mitigate a lot of issues that you would see come time to populate your project with these objects. So when we're talking about consistency, this should be across a lot of things, and this is just a handful. This isn't everything, obviously, but in terms of the level of detail, the quality of the content, the naming, so that's quite important, and I'll show you why. The materials and any shared parameters. So these are all things that we should really have consistency across a complete library. When we're building content, I realize that if you are in a position where you're not building the content yourself and you're having to bring in content from external sources, you wouldn't necessarily have the luxury of necessarily specifying a lot of this stuff. It can be changed if you have the know-how to edit families, which I'm thinking probably if you're building families, you more than likely can clean them up and get them consistent with whatever your standard of choice would be. So a couple of examples here. So just touching on, I suppose, what I was mentioning earlier in terms of creation of manufacturer standards. So this is one of the websites that we publish files to, being design content. So this is largely architectural content, manufacturer specific. So you can see there's a range of ANZ manufacturers. And then we have BIMMAP-Oz, which is more targeted at the services area. So this is like your HVAC, your plumbing, your electrical manufacturers. But needless to say, these have got standards that go along with the content that's built. So, for example, design content, we would use what's called the ANZRS, which is the Australia New Zealand Revit standards. With that, we have a range of shared parameters that are kind of they live within the ANZRS ecosystem, and there's some guidelines around naming of files and best practices around content creation. BIMMAP-Oz, same thing. So this is a separate sort of shared parameter file, and if anyone's sort of scratching their head about what I'm talking about when I say shared parameters, I'll definitely sort of dig into that shortly. But yeah, needless to say, these are just a few examples of some existing standards that live out there. But as I mentioned, this could be just as easily something that you would come up with yourself and batch apply to all of the content that comes out. So what happens if content creation standards aren't applied to the families that you're creating and putting in your projects? Firstly, your projects will end up with a lot of unnecessary stuff loaded in. So this is going to ultimately impact your performance of your project and make the managing of the BIM a lot more difficult. You're just going to be swimming in more information, a lot of it unnecessary, and that becomes a problem downstream. You'll have difficulty finding families or family types or materials that exist within your project. Again, it's just coming back to, well, firstly, naming of things can make that tricky, but also, the more you have in there, the more unnecessary stuff you've got in, the harder it is to find. Time is going to be wasted setting up and entering schedule information, and that sort of comes back to the shared parameters stuff, which I'll touch on. You won't get consistency or clear identity data in your documentation. And you're going to end up wasting time graphically changing things in views just to get it to, I guess, be, readable. So rather than building it consistently and correctly from the outset, you're kind of going to have to do some sort of in-project fudging to make things look right, but they aren't necessarily right if someone was to open that file and have a look. So I'm guessing at least some of these are probably going to sound familiar to some of you out there. And I just want to drill into, I guess, those points and I guess cover off some solutions if I can. So the first one there that we were talking about, the unnecessary stuff impacting project performance. I don't want to spend all my time in PowerPoint here because that's not really going to be very fun for anyone. So I'm going to jump across to Revit here. So what I've got is I'll just start a new project, and this is probably the best way to get a fairly good picture of what comes in with your families, because it is easy to just dump these in and sort of out of sight, out of mind sort of thing. But when we start a new project, we have the option to select a template file, which I'm just going to say none, which is essentially going to bring in the bare bones. If I started it with an architectural out of the box template, it's going to bring in some walls, etc., which I don't want for the purposes of this test. What I'm then going to do is I'll just open the material editor here, and there is some stuff that still comes in even though I haven't selected a template, which I'm just going to delete all of this stuff. Hit OK. I'm then going to come into my Manage tab and purge unused, and I'll just do this a couple of times to make sure so I've got 0. So what we've got here now is very much a bare bones project. There's no materials. There shouldn't be any subcategories. There shouldn't be any families other than the ones that sort of have to be in here as placeholders. So this is kind of a good test to see and understand what is coming in with your content. So I've just got a folder here, and this is just content that I've downloaded off an online resource. I guess from the jump, we can see, there's no real logical file naming here, which straight away is confusing to me because, there's capitals, there's no structure to the file name, which we'll go into in further detail shortly. But main thing I want to capture here is when I bring this into my project, and this shouldn't take very long because it should all be the correct version. Sorry, I was going to have this preloaded, but I thought it would be better to show you, bring it in. Cool, all right, it's done. So if I open my material editor now, you'll see the vast amount of stuff that's come in. So largely, I mean, a lot of this stuff wouldn't be of use, I would think, even in the families themselves. I mean, all of these render materials with an RGB value, these are typically from when you're building content and you bring in a DWG or a CAD reference file and then you don't purge it. These are generally AutoCAD sort of materials that get converted to a Revit material. So, straight off the bat, there's a whole bunch of materials that are living in my project now that I've brought in unknowingly or otherwise that are taking up space, essentially. When I come down to the family, the project browser, I beg your pardon, under my families tab, it's kind of a guessing game around where these families live. And that's to do with the category that they've been built as. I mean, it's just, you can hopefully, and let me just quickly check the other thing that we can also get bogging things down or taking up space is the object style. So I'm just going to expand, say, generic models. Okay, that one's not so bad. Because this is the other place that you'll end up with a lot of unnecessary stuff if you're not careful, is the object styles. So if you're ever wanting to, test what is coming in with your project, with your families rather, and make sure that they're, clean and only using what they need to, starting a new project and doing so without a template applied, purging everything out, including the materials that are living in the material editor, and then bringing in your content and seeing what comes in is kind of a good way to tackle that. So in terms of finding the families or those materials that exist within your project, this is kind of just jumping back. Sorry, I know there's going to be a bit of jumping to and from Revit here, so apologies in advance. So this is when, a logical naming convention comes into play with not only your families, but anything. So a good example of this, if I was to open this project here, I mean, as you sort of saw in this folder, it's kind of a mess in terms of the file names. So if I was to jump over to, say, an example of some content that we've created here to do with the structural space, and I'll just go to details so we can actually kind of see. So we've developed, and I'd encourage probably you all to do the same if you don't already have one in place, a naming convention, which if I was to just share my Excel here. So this is sort of the way that we've used it. And general rule of thumb for naming content and materials is you typically want to work from most general to most specific, going from left to right. And I'll explain why shortly. But to break down our naming convention that we've sort of used in this example here, we typically start things off with the Revit category. That way, we're grouping by Revit category. We're then I suppose applying a subcategory, so whether that is appliance or storage, and there's some examples over here. Sorry, so a generic appliance, microwave. We have some descriptors if need be. They might not necessarily always need to be there. And then if you wanted to, you could also have hosting options, because some things may be face-based or line-based or work plane-based, etc. So how this ends up working is in the context of a library that I've just dumped a whole bunch of content in. It starts to separate things out logically, and as will it in the project browser, by firstly my category, which Revit should automatically do anyway, because obviously we've got the predefined Revit categories that these should automatically go into. But I suppose this is just for more accessing and finding the content outside of Revit itself. This sort of 3-digit category identifier is useful in that respect. So we're sort of starting from the Revit category. We're going across to, whether it's Rio, slab, columns, beams. Within that, then we have, beams in situ, precast, steel, timber. So we're sort of getting more and more specific as we go from left to right. And this is intentional because what we end up with is all of our beams sitting together, all of our steel beams sitting together, and then from there we've got the individual profiles, which are obviously unique. We've got all the timber beams sitting together, all the columns sit together, etc. So this is exactly the same for materials, as you sort of saw back in the, and I don't think I saved it, but did I keep it open? This project here. As you can sort of see here, there's no rhyme or reason as to how these materials have been named. So trying to sort of, go through and find a material could be pretty problematic and not necessarily a logical process to go through. If I was to come back in here where I've sort of loaded in all that content that we had standardized in that standardized folder, same principle applies here in terms of naming the materials as we would with the families themselves, in that we have the overarching material type being concrete, metal, plastic, or wood in this case, and that one should not be there. Then within those categories, we've got whether that metal is aluminium, copper, steel, etc., and we get more granular as we go across. So then how we end up with it is a really logical way of browsing our materials and our families, in that we just kind of logically go from left to right, ultimately ending up with a finish of a specific color of a specific material. So that's sort of a useful tidbit. And I suppose the other thing that you'll notice here, we're not using spaces, we're using underscores to separate the different things, and that's intentional as well. We sort of want to limit the use of spaces if possible. This kind of not only visually breaks it up, but yeah, I would recommend avoiding spaces at all if you can in terms of file naming or material naming. And the reason that we've gone with an underscore, I mean, some there's really not too much reason that you couldn't have a hyphen instead. I prefer an underscore only because there are certain, and this is probably more specifically to do with the families themselves, there are situations where a specific brand name or something, or a product name has a hyphen in between two words, which can get a bit confusing in terms of distinguishing the separators of our name and what should be considered a hyphenated word. So I would sort of lean towards using the underscores as your separators, and then yeah, you can use a hyphen if need be to have those kind of hyphenated references in that file name. So again, if I come through to the appearance asset that's assigned to these materials, I like to assign a appearance asset of the exact same name. So I've always got that link from appearance asset back to the material. I don't know if that's something that you guys prefer to do, or I just find that that's sort of a more safe way of doing things. If I'm changing things, I know that I'm changing the appearance asset attached to this specific material, and it's not having a knock-on effect to other things. The exception being, obviously, if you do have, I guess, a material that you want to update, a bunch of different other materials, you could have a shared appearance asset that just sort of has a more generic name. So that's the logic with file names. Again, you may come up with something that works better for you, but my recommendation is certainly to work from that left to right generic to more specific. You're just going to end up with something that resembles something a lot more cleaner in the project browser, but also in your Windows Explorer also. The other thing to mention, I suppose, as well, is not only the surface level names of the families, but I guess when we get into the families themselves, we do want some consistency in terms of parameter naming and parameter grouping. So what I mean here is we don't want necessarily, this range of structural parameters. In this case, the volume and then the I guess the weight that's being calculated off that. If we've got these parameters, these specific parameters living in the structural parameter group for this beam, we would want that to be reflected in all beams. And I guess typically, once you build one, you can sort of use that as the skeleton to build out all your different profiles. But it is important, equally as important, I think, to not only have consistency at that surface naming level, but also within your parameters, structuring these in a logical way that makes sense. I suppose just to highlight something here. So these are a bunch of calculated parameters that are working in the background. I typically reserve this other group for anything that's calculated that I just want to be out of the way. And the reason being because it's sort of at the end. You don't want to have to scroll through a whole bunch of calculated parameters to get to, say, stuff that you want to access, like these stick symbol offsets, etc. So yeah, again, you may have your own approach, or you may adopt one that's better. But the main thing is that there is a procedure in place, and everyone's sort of on board with that procedure when it comes to naming and structuring these families. Just jumping back into here, sorry. So when we talk about the scheduling of families, this is ultimately coming back to the shared parameter files. And I think, a lot of you probably have had exposure to shared parameter files, but just in case you haven't, what that essentially is if I was to, say, draw this beam here, this beam here, and maybe this one here. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and do a structural framing schedule. And this brings up this schedule properties dialog. So essentially what we would end up with, and I know that these families are using the same shared parameters across the various families, which means if I was to, and I'm just trying to think which one, maybe the, let me grab, let's just go weight. And I'll just go family and type. Okay. So because this is using this specific ANZRS weight net parameter, and I guess to show you what a shared parameter file looks like, if you're wondering, it is a bit scary when you see it under the hood, but it does make perfect sense. So let me go to, all right. So this is the ANZRS. So it essentially opens as a text file, and I'll just, sorry, it's opening on my other screen here, so I'll just bring it across. So this is what it looks like when we open it, essentially. And each row reflects a shared parameter. So if you're wondering also, a shared parameter is, and I'll just jump into here. So basically we've got a couple of different parameters in Revit that we can assign to various things in our content. So family, shared, and system parameters. So these system parameters are typically the ones that come in the template. So these are built in. You can't sort of add them or remove them. Family parameters are ones that we add, but we don't necessarily need to schedule them or what have you. So all of those calculator values that we were seeing before, they'd be family parameters. I don't want to schedule or tag those. And only these shared parameters and system parameters can be scheduled or tagged. So that's important. So when you're dealing with things like width, height, depth, material, these are sort of critical conditions of most objects that go into your project. So if we were talking about width, for example, we wouldn't want a million different width shared parameters, each with their own unique identifier. So this GUID here, which is like a unique set of numbers, is what tells us that when I load, say, this acoustic rating parameter into a family using this shared parameter file, if I then go into another file, loaded that same parameter, because it's using the same ID, when it comes time to generate my schedule, it's not going to report potentially 10, 20 different acoustic rating parameters for me to schedule, which becomes a major nightmare because you don't know what parameters are assigned to what. So this is just a lot more clean, a cleaner way to do it. By the way, for anyone wondering, to create a shared parameter file, it's not as complex as doing anything in this environment. You actually have a dedicated sort of shared parameter dialog through Revit, which is a lot more user-friendly, where you can create your own and just add parameters. And again, that's something that you may already have in-house, or if not, you should potentially think about creating either a firm-specific shared parameter file to adopt when you're building any content that comes out. So hopefully that gives some context on the importance of the parameters that we use, so the grouping, but also defining whether it's a family or a shared parameter. That's also very important. And you'll waste time graphically changing things in all of the views in your project in order to make them as readable as possible. So this is, there's a few things that we can do here, right? So taking these beams, for example, if I was to, I guess, come in here, and this one might be a bad example, but Revit having these inbuilt detail levels, coarse, medium, and fine. Typically how we treat this, and what I might do, sorry, is I'll just grab one of those non-standardized ones so we can kind of do a bit of a side-by-side here. So I'm just dragging in one that I know is particularly big. You can see this sofa is way bigger than we would typically want a Revit family, but it does look like that's just been imported from another application. It's not sort of natively modeled in Revit. I can sort of tell that from all the faces and vertices on this thing. But what you can sort of see when it comes to consistency is if I was to come back into my standardized folder and grab, so we've got a few beams, but let's just say maybe this laser printer. All right, cool. So basically when we, oh, sorry, did that come in? Yeah, there it is. So when we're building content, it is a good idea to integrate some level of detail control using these 3 inbuilt levels. So as you can see, this sofa, we're at coarse detail level here, and we're seeing absolutely everything there is to see on this sofa, including sort of the beveled edges of the cushions and everything else. Now, I know that that's a result of this thing not being natively modeled in Revit, which is a problem in itself. But, you know, it could also be, if this was natively modeled in Revit, this could be greatly simplified to show something like this is, where it's just sort of taking up an overall depth, width, and height. Because at coarse, that's typically all we're concerned about. So you can see with the beam, it's just sort of, we're not even seeing anything in terms of a profile. It's just giving me the location and the length. This printer is just giving me where it is and then how much space it takes up. As we go through to medium, we start to get some, you know, more sort of identifying features come through. As we go to fine, we get some other stuff that makes it maybe a bit more sort of pleasant to the eye if we were to render it or something like that. And with the beam, we're sort of starting to see the filleted edges, the filleted corners where we're not with medium. So this couch is staying the exact same highly detailed model in all views, which becomes a problem when I want to rotate around my view, say in coarse mode, which is sort of typically just, you know, for coordination and checking that, you know, things are where they need to be. I don't want to have to deal with something like that couch needing to be calculated in the background as Revit's sort of doing its thing. So that's, I think, you know, having that level of consistency when it comes to deciding what gets shown at various, not only detail levels, but at various views. So for example, if I was to jump back to a floor plan, you know, in this particular example, at a floor plan, we're seeing a symbol for the printer. We're not actually seeing the physical printer. In fact, if we were to go to a fine detail level, we can see the 3D geometry, medium and coarse. This family's just been elected to show a symbol. So it's not that we can just show geometry at certain detail levels, but we can also have that combined with certain views as well. So if I was to look at this elevation, similar to how we can have and sorry, I haven't drawn that beam especially straight, so let me fix that up. Just want to show that there is a symbolic representation at coarse to give us the actual shape of that. So yeah, we can sort of combine, you know, what's being seen at any given detail level and in any given view, which is very useful. And as sort of mentioned, we don't want a situation like this where certain stuff has been built to a specific detail level, and then we just have something like this that's just sort of a bit of a shock to the system when it sits alongside that other stuff. So I just want to sort of recap on, I guess, the process when it comes to mapping out the creation of certain Revit content. Questions to ask yourself are, do I need to schedule or quantify certain aspects of it? In which case, if the answer is yes, is there an available built-in parameter? As you know, there is for, say, manufacturer, URL. These are sort of predefined built-in parameters that it would make sense to use. If there's not, you would need to have a shared parameter that is reflecting that value and have that available in the family. How many of these will be placed in a project? So this is kind of coming back to that detail level thing. If it's something like, you know, a light switch that you may have hundreds of them in a project, does it make sense to go down to modeling, you know, the fixing points? I would say no, because yeah, Revit is, you know, a building design software. It's not a fabrication solution. So typically we would just model sort of what we see, and even then largely focus on the metadata that goes in the background. It is important to have it look like the real product, so you can sort of identify it and say that's a light switch. But yeah, it wouldn't be a matter of But if it is something like a feature that you've only got one of, it may make sense to make that more detailed. I would recommend though having the control over the detail level, so maybe it just shows as a basic box or something at course, so you're not contending with complex geometry at those earlier stages of your design. How many views will it be seen in? So this is sort of going back to that beam example where we may have certain things showing up at certain views, that profile, for example. Again, sort of similar point here, how we want it to look in various views. These are all things to ask yourself, I guess, before you build the piece of content, rather than sort of building it and then retrospectively going back. Does it need to hook into MEP systems? So will it need, connector elements and versions? So this is very important because, as we probably all know, Revit is not backwards compatible, which is to say, if I was to build a piece of content now in 2022, I think that's not out just yet, but let's just say, for argument's sake, 2021, anyone using Revit prior to 2021, version 2021, would not be able to consume that piece of content, which is a problem. So because we build the content for many manufacturers, we're sort of in line with Autodesk, so supporting 4 versions. So now that 2022 is about to drop, I would say that we're starting to create content in 2019, which gives us 19, 20, 21, and 22. That way we're sort of, we're not necessarily alienating anyone, because typically that's in line with what Autodesk supports, but it just means that we're not also missing out on any functionality that may have come in with those later versions. So I think that probably wraps it up, and I am mindful of time here, so I don't know, Dexter, if anyone's got any questions, and I am just reading the chat, and I do apologize for not having the microphone on there at the beginning. Is there any questions there at all, Dexter? I think you might be muted now, mate, if you're trying to talk. Just thinking something else I could show you in the interim. Because I did mention, we'd have a quick look at system families. So these behave in a bit of a different way. So if I had a basic wall, and let's just say I renamed this one to be, I don't know, test wall. Okay. So a good way to manage metadata inside system families, if I had one version and I wanted to create a bunch of different color options or something like that for this particular wall type, I'd duplicate these out, and then I've got I beg your pardon, let me come into here. Okay, sorry, take 2. All right. Let me just dock this properly. All right, I'll just rename this one as test, and I'm just going to duplicate a whole bunch of times here. Because I don't know if anyone's sort of spent much time updating values in a system family, but it can be quite cumbersome when you've got to dig in here to the type properties, and that's just opened here, and manipulate the metadata that comes in here. It can be a bit cumbersome because you could miss things. So a useful sort of approach is using something like BIMLink. So this is a plugin that sits within Revit. All right, so new, I can go by category, walls. I can select the type link. All right, so here I'm sort of cracking into the parameters that I want to change. So let's just say manufacturer. By the way, I could have custom parameters, project parameters that are assigned to this particular wall category, maybe description, type name, and I'll just go done. I can then export that. That'll do. Open that. And now what we're doing is, and you can imagine, you know, I could have a whole bunch of parameters, but I'm sort of more concerned with, I'm not really concerned with these or these, because these are just the stuff that was in there. So let me delete that out. So these are the walls that I've just created. I can give these, you know, a unique name. And I know that this is probably a silly rename that I'm giving it, but basically it takes out a lot of the errors that may come from trying to manage this in Revit itself. So manufacturer, that could be anything. Description, this could be unique, but you're also, you know, harnessing the power of Excel. So you've got autofill sort of functionalities, and if I save that, come back to my project, I can import and wall types. Oh geez, I gotta think about which one. This one, I think. Oh no. Sorry, import walls types. Cool. So this is just telling me these values are going to change. Hit import and jump back over to my project browser. If I crack into the project here, into the property, sorry, you can see that that metadata has flowed through. So yeah, that obviously a bit of a different approach to system families, but there are solutions out there. Okay, sorry. So Salvi, I can see a question. Previous versions of Revit, there's some rubbish that we bring to the project that we couldn't remove, even purging it. Is the latest version now can purge all those rubbish? So the short answer is there is likely to be stuff that lives in the background, which there is a tool that I've got, which is a free tool, Revit Lookup. And this is kind of even a more of a peek behind the curtain of the stuff that comes in with your components that you bring in. But what this allows you to do is even sort of say, I guess, shared parameters. You know, these shared parameters, I wouldn't necessarily ever know that they live in the project. But what I can do is, if you've got also, right, material appearance assets. So, you know, these are all living in here, even though I don't necessarily have a material that's associated to. But it also is kind of cool because it gives me the unique ID number for every one of these elements, which means that if I've got, say, a whole bunch of stuff that's living way in the background, I can take that ID number and feed it into the manage, select by ID, basically enter that number, and it will, Revit will select that element in the background, and then if I hit delete, it will go. So that's, I don't know if there's other tools out there that do that, but yeah, that's Revit Lookup, which is a really handy tool, which kind of, again, cracks down a bit further than your typical purge would. So I don't know if that helps at all. I don't think 2021 has, you know, sort of more improved purging capabilities, but yeah, that's sort of my recommendation there. So I don't know if there's any questions there. Doesn't seem like. Save a Revit project file with material images embedded in, so you don't need to relink. Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm just reading this one, which is if there's a way to save a Revit project with material images embedded. The short answer is unfortunately not. That's kind of something that we're up against, particularly in 2021. But yes, it would involve. It does live as a sort of, I guess, an XREF where you would need to. So how we would typically transmit a project of walls that has their own textures is we would have a dedicated folder with all the images required alongside sort of, I guess, a set of instructions, and then it would simply be zipped up with the corresponding project file. So yeah, there's unfortunately the images themselves need to live and I guess be sent with the Revit file. It would be nice if they would be embedded, but sadly, no. The short answer is you would have to sort of package them up and send them with the project. Does BIM 360 host images? I'd have to check that, to be honest. I'll find that out. I would imagine that it wouldn't sort of link it back to the project. You'd still have to have them. It wouldn't be embedded in the project itself, I wouldn't have thought, but because Revit is only going to be looking for a specific link, like a file path, rather than have that sort of I guess as a decal that lives in the file. But I might have to sort of come back to you on that, Matt, if that's okay. So I don't know if there's anything else. No. Sounds like it might be all the questions. I'll just flick over to here. If obviously if anything comes up or you've got any questions that you think of down the line, do feel free to reach out and ask anything. Obviously this is the website, but via here you'll sort of have to contact us and be able to reach myself or anyone else that you may be interested in getting more information about. So appreciate your time, everyone. I do realize that it's a bit of a chunk out of your day, so I do appreciate your time to come and have a listen. And yeah, as mentioned, do feel free to reach out if there's any questions at all. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a great day.